Hi, this is Bio156, Chapter 6, How Cells Harvest Chemical Energy. This is the fourth of 7 videos for this lecture topic.
In this video, we'll do a brief review of the 3 stages of cellular respiration, and then we'll dive in more depth into how glycolysis harvests chemical energy by oxidizing glucose to pyruvate. Now remember that our cells perform cellular respiration, which is the process of breaking down the energy from food molecules to release ATP, which your cell can use to power the work of the cell. We start off with C6H12O6. That's the chemical formula for glucose, although your cells can use other food molecules, but we'll use glucose as our example. And this is an aerobic process, meaning that it requires oxygen. 6 molecules of oxygen, in fact, for every molecule of glucose that you're breaking down. And we end up releasing about 32 ATP, and that ATP is used for cellular work, powering the reactions of the cell. Now, a quick note, that number, 32, that's kind of a squishy number. You'll see different textbooks giving different numbers for that, from between 32 up to about 38 ATP. We're going to go with 32 for ours. And the reason why there are different numbers is because different textbooks sometimes use different ways to calculate how many ATP you get out at the end, and you're not always getting exactly this amount for every molecule of food. So we're just going to go with about 32 ATP for our purposes. Now from one glucose molecule we get about 32 ATP molecules, and that's equivalent to about 34% of the energy in glucose to begin with. That means the other 66% is lost as heat. And this chemical equation, this is a very important equation. You want to know this backwards and forwards. It will likely come up on the test. In this chemical equation, we have our reactants on the left side here, glucose and oxygen. And then we have our main product, energy. This is the purpose of the entire reaction. So that's our main product. But then we also have some byproducts, carbon dioxide and water, which are produced as a result of this process, but they're not the main focus of this reaction or series of reactions. All right, so cellular respiration uses the electron transport chains and those 2 shuttle molecules that we introduced, NADH and FADH2. Those molecules, remember those are electron shuttlers, or in other words, they're kind of like Uber and Lyft. So they're services that will take things from one place to another. In this case, they're taking electrons from one place to another. But they just drop them off at their location. So they take them from one place, drop them off at another place. And these molecules and the electron transport chains help to transfer the energy of glucose carried by those high energy electrons into the chemical ATP, the organic molecule ATP. There are 3 main stages in cellular respiration for eukaryotic cells, and there are many steps in each of these stages. I'm not going to make you memorize each of those steps, but you do need to know each of the 3 main stages and the outcomes for each of the stages and some of the details in between, which we'll be talking about. So stage 1 is glycolysis. Stage 2 is pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. And stage 3 is oxidative phosphorylation. Together, these 3 stages work together to generate ATP for the cell. Glycolysis is the first stage. That happens in the cytoplasm. And what happens here is that glucose gets split into 2 molecules of pyruvate, and then that pyruvate travels into the mitochondrion and undergoes oxidation here. Oxidation, remember that's losing electrons. So pyruvate loses some electrons and is converted into a different molecule, which we'll talk about later, and that molecule enters the citric acid cycle and is completely oxidized down to carbon dioxide. And we're getting a little bit of ATP in each of these steps, but not too much. And then finally, our third step, oxidative phosphorylation, is also taking place in the mitochondria, and this is where we produce the most ATP, this third step. All right, so in this video, we're going to be talking about the first stage, glycolysis. We'll do a quick overview of it, and then we'll talk in a little more detail about what's going on here. So glycolysis, as we mentioned, is happening in the cytoplasmic cell fluid, the cytosol or cytoplasm. And in glycolysis, we're breaking glucose down into the 3-carbon molecule pyruvate. 1 molecule of glucose ends up yielding 2 molecules of pyruvate. Glucose originally has 6 carbons, and pyruvate has 3 carbons. So we're just breaking those carbons apart into 2 3-carbon molecules. All right, let's talk a little bit more about how this happens then. First of all, let's break apart that name, glycolysis. So that root word glyco means sweet, and the root word lysis means to split or break. So glycolysis literally means the splitting of something sweet, like sugar. Glycolysis, again, takes place in the cytoplasm. In this diagram here, this shows the entire process of glycolysis, but very abbreviated. So we start off with glucose, we end up with 2 molecules of pyruvate. And in this diagram, those gray balls represent carbon atoms. So we have 6 originally for glucose, and then we have 3 for each of those 2 pyruvate molecules. And this is much more complicated than it's showing. There are actually 9 chemical steps in glycolysis, and each of them has their own enzyme. Luckily for you guys, you don't have to memorize that in this class, although if you go on to take a biochemistry class, you likely will. And in the process, we do take 2 NAD+, that's the oxidized form of NADH, and so we reduce it, meaning we're adding electrons to NADH. And so we have now these 2 NADH molecules that have electrons. They're going to carry those to the electron transport chain in stage 3. We also end up making 2 molecules of ATP. So in glycolysis, we're breaking glucose down to release 2 pyruvate molecules, and we produce 2 ATP molecules from 2 ADP molecules. So remember, ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate, which has 2 phosphate groups attached to it. And so we take ADP, we add a phosphate group onto it, and it becomes ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which has 3 phosphate groups on it. In glycolysis, we are also producing 2 NADH from 2 NAD+. Each of them is carrying 2 electrons. And finally, we end up with 2 molecules of the 3-carbon molecule pyruvate. So glycolysis is really the stage of 2s. We have 2 ATP, 2 NADH. Each NADH has 2 electrons, and we end up with 2 molecules of pyruvate. Glycolysis uses a process called substrate-level phosphorylation in order to make those ATP that we're getting out of it. What that means is that ATP is made by transferring phosphate groups from other organic molecules to ADP. And there is a specific enzyme involved that brings these together so they can react. And this substrate-level phosphorylation is also seen in stage 2 in the citric acid cycle, but it's different from what we see in stage 3, oxidative phosphorylation, which depends on a different process, which we'll talk about when we get to that point. But for now, understand that glycolysis uses substrate level phosphorylation, where we're taking an organic substrate that has phosphate groups, attached to it, and we're transferring one of those phosphate groups to ADP to make it ATP. Now, as we mentioned, glycolysis takes many steps, 9 steps, to go from start to finish. It is a metabolic pathway, which means that it has these multiple steps, and each step leads to the next step. And we end up forming intermediates along the way. Intermediates meaning molecules that are usually pretty short-lived because they're produced by one enzyme and then grabbed up by the next enzyme in the chain. And they're not usually our ending product. They're intermediates along the way. And so an example of this is glucose 6-phosphate right here, which is the result of the very first step in glycolysis. Now, while I'm not going to make you memorize every step, you do need to memorize the 2 phases of glycolysis. The first is the energy investment phase. This is the first 4 steps here. And this phase actually consumes or uses up energy. You can see from the diagram that we're taking 2 molecules of ATP and breaking it down to ADP, and we're actually adding the phosphate group from ATP onto our organic molecules here, our intermediates. Now that's weird. Why would we need to use up energy if we're trying to make energy, right? Well, this is a requirement of the process. It's required for the enzymes to actually do their job, and it's kind of like priming a pump. Sometimes you need to put a little water into the pump in order to get things going so that you can actually produce more water in the end. So after that energy investment phase, we have an energy payoff phase. That's the last 5 steps of glycolysis, and these last steps yield some energy. Not a lot. We end up making 4 more ATP molecules, which minus those 2 that we invested originally, gives us a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. But then we also get the 2 NADH that we got per glucose molecule. So remember, this energy payoff phase is going to happen twice because at this point we've already broken glucose down to a 3-carbon organic molecule. So each of those 3-carbon molecules goes through this, and we end up with then 2 molecules of pyruvate at the end.
Just to put your minds at ease, you don't need to know the information on the last 2 slides for this class. It's there to show you that this process is more complicated from a chemistry point of view. And if you do end up taking biochemistry down the line, you'll go into the details of each step of glycolysis. So at least you'll have a good foundation for that if you end up doing that. All right, let's try a lecture quiz question. This is Chapter 6, Lecture Quiz Question 5. Where in the cell does glycolysis occur? A, in the cytoplasm, B, in the endoplasmic reticulum, C, in the fluid of the mitochondria, or D, on the outer mitochondrial membrane? Go ahead and pause the video here while you answer this question.
So in review, glycolysis is the first stage of cellular respiration. There are 9 steps total, and they result in 2 pyruvates, 2 NADH, and 2 ATP. And we have 2 phases, the energy investment phase and the energy payoff phase. Let's try a practice question. The correct answer here is C. Glucose is broken down to 2 pyruvate molecules during glycolysis. Let's try another practice question. The correct answer here is B, that enzymes transfer a phosphate from an organic molecule to ADP to form ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So that's what substrate level phosphorylation means. There's that term substrate. Remember, substrates are things that enzymes work on.
That concludes this part of the lecture. This has been Bio 156, Chapter 6, Video 4 of 7.